Kelly and I would like to acknowledge the Yugara and Turrbal peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which we live, learn, and teach, and pay our respects to elders past and present. We express our gratitude to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the longest continuous civilizational cultures in the world, for their care of this land.
Thanks, Cal. So today we're going to take you through probably the two streams that we operated within. There was a bit of a mainstream approach, and we also have excellence classes. So I'll talk more about how I was working with the mainstream classes, and then Cal will jump in and talk more about how we explored this particular unit with our excellence groups. You can see on the screen a Facebook and LinkedIn post that pretty much was the highlight, I suppose, for the kids and for us of the unit, and it is showing our simulated dig, or what we called a simulated dig, and we were very careful to talk about it as a simulated dig, and you'll see as we talk through our presentations that idea of an ethical approach was pretty important to us. So our pedagogical approach was based on these four key things. So one was that hands-on learning. We were all about engagement. So I'm one of these people who is teaching out of field. I'm not a history humanities teacher. I'm English drama dance. But as head of middle years, I was very interested in ensuring that the students across year 7 were getting an engaging unit that was relevant to them and gave them some real, the hands-on approach, that experiential learning as much as possible, while also encouraging a little bit of curiosity along the way. So you've seen one of our experiential activities there with the simulated dig, but we also had some diverse interactive sources. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in terms of our successes, but it was us Kelly and I going to the conference that the two Georges organised at the end of 2023 that really spearheaded this. We had the option to wait a year, and after going to that conference, we didn't want to wait. We wanted to start now. So we had the resources coming from that particular conference, and it was a really great experience. So I highly recommend any of those conferences for anyone in the future, because basically they became our network, and we would contact them on a regular basis, and they would give us advice, and we would share our lessons. So I can't recommend that anymore. The ethical considerations in First Nations history was a big one. We asked the question a lot of inquiry-based approaches, things like who owns the past. So that came again from that conference. So students would show a lot of their misconceptions when you would ask questions like that, even asking them after the simulated dig. So if you found something in your backyard, what would you do? And so even after us discussing some of those ethical considerations, the responses from our students were still quite enlightening. And so there was a lot of correction there, I suppose, in terms of the misinformation that they had. Another really powerful interactive tool that we had was the time machine. I call it my time machine. And it's a bit slow and a bit clunky at first, but once you get used to it, you actually can show the students in a visual manner the changes geographically, the changes in the land formation. So we were making connections to geography from the beginning. We were making connections to our current roadways throughout that as well. So we would overlap the current major highways with the highways that were created by our First Nations Australians. And that was very eye-opening for our students as well. And I don't think without that interactive tool, we would have gotten that as clearly for them. And showing the correlation or the connection between the megafauna and our First Peoples was another moment for high tension debate, and did a bit of a see what I learned, what I knew, and what I still wonder. And the most common question was they wondered how they interacted with the megafauna. That was one of the biggest questions that came out of that. And then obviously our local area analysis. So we were really lucky that we have a scar tree on campus. and that there is a story. We have Oxley Creek nearby, and there are stories that we found in the local library that would talk about the use of the trees to make them into canoes, and how that was something that was actually occurring between the First Nations Australians and early colonialists. Sorry, cannot speak today. So that was a really interesting moment for them because they weren't looking at it in a picture; they were standing in front of the tree. And I know that Kel will probably speak a little bit more about that in our current teaching of it. So the mainstream classes, it was about this time machine. And so that's a little clip from what that time machine will show. And you can see that the land formations are really obvious there. And as you slide through and you travel through in time, you see how those land formations change. You can add in some different things there that allow you to see where communities grew, the kinds of things that were developing, and all the way through, obviously, to colonization. Don't know why I can't say that word today. The other thing that was really powerful, and this came straight from the conference, and we were very grateful to the Georges for sharing this, was this idea of a clock. So showing time in this way was quite powerful for our kids, and particularly breaking down that last, I think it's the 30 seconds, and it's really that last 30 seconds is us. So them seeing where a lot of the things that they assumed were older sat in the clock was quite powerful for them. And I know Kel did this in a slightly different way with her excellence kids, and she'll talk to you about that. There's already been a number of questions about textbooks and how did people learn? How did people know what to do in terms of teaching this unit? Ours was very much based on that network, and then we used Jack Plus and EdPerfect for our textbooks with the kids, and then our simulated dig. We also had, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, everyone. We also had very much a source-based analysis. So we might do this as an introduction and just encouraging that inquiry. So what's your questions? What questions do you have about this image? Which was interesting because then obviously we lead into our study of Mungo Man, and some of those questions are answered, some of them aren't, which makes them want to pursue it even further. And lots of collaborative work where we would set off in jigsaw a jigsaw approach where we would give them all a source, and then they would come back and they would talk about their three answers and what they discovered from that particular source that they'd read. And they're set up, there's a few little codes there for me that it's, well, not personalized, but it is differentiated for the different levels. So some of those, like the @ symbol that's a nice mainstream one, but I did still have some very strong students in there. So those exclamation marks are more, hey, that actually could be good for somebody who's needing a bit more challenge. So being careful about how to pick those kids and put them in the right places as well, as much as possible. And I talked a little bit about our scar tree. So this is one of the sources that we found about what had been shared around Oxley Creek, and originally it even been called Canoe Creek. So that just added an extra layer because they had to walk past that or drive past it every day. So while ours wasn't place-based, it was more source-based. That experiential and being able to see some of these, when we were teaching about heritage sites, and we asked the question, why do you think the school can't cut this tree down? And that was an interesting discussion as well. And so it was a little bit more relevant to them rather than in this textbook, why wouldn't they have been allowed to mine that particular area? We did all of that as well, but this brought it home for them. I'll hand over to, oh, sorry, one more thing from me. From the simulated dig, it wasn't, whatever. It was definitely set out in terms of an archaeological story that they could be telling. So they had their reference materials, you'll see up in the top right-hand corner there, so they could see what it was that they were likely finding. The coloured table up the top there is a bit of a cheat sheet for me. So each of the boxes had a coloured card on the side of them, and then only those particular artifacts or those simulated artifacts would end up in there, so that as I'm going around, I know what the kids are expected to find, but also the sort of story that they might be telling at the end. So they worked their way through, they answered some questions down here on an artifact sheet. They sketched it. They were very engaged that day. And year sevens at Corinda aren't always engaged, I have to say. But they were right into it. They very much enjoyed finding the artifacts, sketching the artifacts, and then coming up with their own archaeological story about what might have happened here, and just the idea that, oh, there's a toy spear, so there must have been a child with this particular group. And, it must have been, they worked out that it was land-based, or they worked out that it was near the ocean or on the beach based on the things that were found there. The seashell rattle, while very difficult to try and replicate there, was actually an interesting one for them to realize what it was, and all of the connections that could be made to that one simulated artifact. So it was quite a powerful moment. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Cal.
Okay, so as Leigh mentioned, we also have an excellence program for humanities and English, and I am fortunate enough to teach that class. So we go about things a little bit differently. These students tend to be more inherently engaged in a lot of these, so it's a little bit less hands-on, although they were very jealous looking across the corridor when the dig was happening, and they were asking me a lot of questions about it. So we've highlighted just some of the different mind mapping things that we've used, obviously mini whiteboards, which most of us are familiar with, just for taking draft notes while we're watching videos. We've got some mind maps, which I'll go into a bit further later, just different note-taking strategies. And then probably the biggest thing for me was trying to grasp this idea of scale. As it was mentioned through Kath and Pete, kids don't have the best idea of time. And so trying to get our heads around that. I've forgotten the order I put my slides. So I've got the mind maps here. I'll get you to go back, Leigh. And these are from my current students. So this is my second year actually teaching this unit. And what I wanted to really emphasize this year, second time round, was those connections and getting the students to see those connections as well. So like your typical mind map, we've got our big topic in the middle, the dreaming, and then our little subtopics. We've got stories, sacred objects and sites, art, country, songs. The students came up with these as their subtopics based on their readings and their viewing of the sources. And then collaboratively, we put together what each of those subtopics encompasses, and then how we can make those connections across the page and across the culture. So again, very low prep, easy to implement. We went back to this probably over 2 or 3 different lessons. We would go back and add extra information. We would add extra connections. These two might not look that busy, but they were probably 2 of the neatest ones, not necessarily the biggest ones, but 2 of the neatest ones to get across that you can make those connections relatively easily, and that the year sevens can start to make those connections as well. This is a visual representation of my first attempt at grasping at scale. So this is along the back wall of the classroom that I was in last year. We had 2 separate timelines going. I ran them over 6.5 meters. I'm fortunate enough to have a pretty wide classroom. The top timeline that you can see there, and I'll highlight it in the next slide, is our deep time past. So looking at 1 meter representing 10,000 years of history. So it stretched most of the way across the classroom. And you can see the cards along the top there had various sources. We talked about bone beads, we talked about Tasmania getting separated, documented use of boomerangs, Mungo Man, Mungo Lady, obviously. And then underneath in the second term, we added a second timeline for our more classical societies that we were looking at. Everything was color-coded. So India, Greece, Rome, Egypt, China all got their own different colours. But their timeline, even though it still ran 6 meters, was that 1 meter represented 500 years because if we tried to put all of those classical societies, what we tend to think of when we think of ancient history, on the same scale as the deep time past of Australia, as you can see up in that top photo, everything along that bottom timeline would have to be jammed into that first little bit, highlighted in yellow between the 5,000 and today. And the students seeing that, yeah, the pyramids are really, really old, but let's have a look across the room at just how long Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been doing their dances and creating their art and setting up fish traps. They've been doing it for at least 13 times longer than the pyramids. And that, I think, was probably the breakthrough moment for my class, of getting them to understand just how long people have been living and caring for this land. I've zoomed in a little bit for that bottom picture so that you can see in a little bit more detail some of the things. Hopefully you can also see that pretty much all of the writing, except for the time markers or the date markers, they're actually done by the students. And I understand that not all classes will have the opportunity to look at all 5 of those classical civilizations in their second history unit, but it can be, the timeline aspect of it can be done within one lesson to provide a larger context. For example, at Corinda, the students in mainstream will be looking at Egypt, but the teachers will still be providing that context of Egypt within those other civilizational cultures and also within that deep time past, so they can see it's just in that tiny little part of the history of ancient Australia.
Okay, so that leads really nicely into our successes. So I've spoken a lot about us using those resources from the Australian Archaeological Association conference that we went to in December. It was the very last day of school, and we were very enthused from the even at that last point of the year, to then kick in and rejuvenate our history program the following year. The 3D model library was actually a bit of a game changer. So it took a little while to navigate, and we're happy to share the links that we were given ultimately from the Georges anyway. But getting our technology department to do that, and it became a real cross-curricular effort there. So I was wandering around different faculties looking for different things, science department loaning me certain things, and then the technology department, both with the wood and things like that that we would grab to show some of the different artifacts in that simulated fashion was quite interesting as well. And what was really interesting was around that curiosity, how they were very curious about the time machine, particularly with that connection to the megafauna. Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Cal, about successes? No?
Probably going to visit the tree at the front. We're really fortunate at Corinda that we have some very, very old gum trees. We've got a beautiful stand of silver gums out in the courtyard, which look magnificent after the rain. And even this year, going out, it was after we'd had some significant rainfall, and one of the other trees out in the front section of the campus had actually shed a lot of bark, and in very, very long strips, probably nearly a foot wide, and a good 10 to 12 feet long. And so as they'd fallen, they'd naturally just curved and curled and then dried out into those shapes. And so going from the scar tree, and one of my tallest students actually tracing the scar as far up as he could reach, and then thinking about how that was used not only as a marker but also as a resource, going down the playground not too far and being able to pick up some of that bark that had naturally dried into a curved shape and was quite strong in that shape. I think, again, it was one of those light bulb moments for the students to see how you could take what they thought was a very stiff and unmalleable product, but just seeing how with knowledge of the seasons and the impact of the rains, how that could then be used to make things like the canoes that we had pictures of back in our classroom.
You might have picked up that I'm not at Corinda anymore. I'm at a different school, but certainly last year when we were doing that, that was a really powerful moment having all the little tours. Like everybody was doing it at roughly the same time. So there was a bit of co-teaching would happen as well. So I know people are talking about the out of field or not feeling as comfortable. It was really great for some of our first year teachers to have another teacher already standing there and speaking to it. And we did have a lot of that reference material we gave to our teachers ahead of time so that they could speak confidently at the time. Some of the challenges, I suppose, for us, we spoke about being respectful and appropriate to our First Nations people a lot. Not having Indigenous heritage ourselves, we were very conscious of the students in our rooms that did. And I know I certainly had one particular student that I would check in on a regular basis with and say, you know, like, is there anything you want to contribute in the next lesson around what we did today? Just checking in and making sure. But that constant making sure we weren't being disrespectful or that what was coming up in the class discussions was not dealt with in a way that ended up being respectful for those people and just for the culture and full stop. Acknowledging and redirecting some of the misinformation. We definitely heard some dinner table conversations coming through in some of our debates. So walking carefully with that one as well, but also redirecting with sources. And that's where we came from. We would always come from a source-based, not an opinion-based approach. So I think that helped a little bit. We didn't have access to community in 2024. I know Kel's been doing a lot of work towards that to see if we can do a little bit more of that. And I know teacher buy-in was another one you had. Kel, do you want to speak to those two?
Yeah, so some of it, again, if we come back to the misinformation and those dinner table conversations, some of our colleagues grew up with those same dinner table conversations, and it's usually just a lack of opportunity of their own learning. And so there was a lot of teacher learning happening. We also have a lot of early career teachers and graduate teachers who are coming in who are still just learning how to be teachers and own their own rooms. And then we're throwing at them what can be a very fraught topic, depending on how it's being received within the room. Buy-in this year was a little bit tricky. We had a lot of curveballs thrown at us. Our students have a week of orientation to begin with. Then in week 3, they went on camp for 3 days. So we lost 2 out of our 3 lessons for the week. Then we had the storms associated with the cyclone. So everyone felt like we were probably not doing things as authentically as we could, and just trying to get through as much as we could in terms of understanding significance and heritage and that respect and the ethics. One of the other ethical concerns that came up was in regards to looking at pictures of remains. And I actually hit up Georgia Williams with this request of looking at the Willandra Lakes and Lake Mungo sites, of trying to get some images for the students that were sketches of Mungo Man's burial, original ceremonial burial, just to try to pay respect to the fact that he is a person who lived and loved and was cared for and was important. And Year 7s are surprisingly capable of getting their heads around that respect. And so, like Leigh showed earlier, one of the sources is actually the footprints from Willandra Lakes instead. And so we tried to find sources that were still respectful, or using text descriptions where we do have the images, but the use of the images might not necessarily be the best way to acknowledge the evidence and the artifacts and the people that we have access to.
I'm mindful of time because we both can talk about this forever. We love it.
Yes.
I know, again, not being able to speak about it from this point of view, but from the what's happening now because I've moved on to a different school. But perhaps if you want to talk a little bit to this one, Cal.
Yeah, so this year we definitely went more source-based. There was a lot more looking at artifacts, a lot more emphasis on the journey through Sunda and onto Sahul, and looking at the evidence, the tools, and the artworks, especially around North Queensland, that we can use for evidence of that human migration. So getting the students more exposed to those sources and those visual elements. The exam was adjusted to more closely align with those content descriptors and especially those achievement standards. Again, that Kath and Pete put up for us, talking about that significance of the histories and the significance of the heritage sites. We actually looked at Budgebim, Brewarrina, and Uluru through our heritage site case studies, moving that scale timeline into mainstream. So last year was a bit of a test balloon, and a lot of our classes this year actually set up their own timelines. And as they were looking at sources, they were placing them on the timeline. So a lot of our teachers did some wonderful stuff with the visuals of things like the tools or the canoes or the artworks that we could see. What archaeological evidence do we have, and where can we fit that in time?